Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a really fascinating, highly charged, and deeply partisan piece of commentary that recently caught our attention. We're going to take an objective look at how the creator of this source material takes a classic, well-known sociological theory about urban decay and aggressively maps it straight onto modern political strategies. Now, as always, our goal here isn't to take a side. We just want to break down the anatomy of the argument itself. We're going to unpack the claims being made, the data they're using, and exactly how they construct this narrative so you can see firsthand how this specific political perspective is built.
Okay, let's dive into this. The commentary kicks things off with a pretty simple, but honestly highly effective thought experiment. Just picture yourself walking down the street. On your left, you've got a house with neat flower beds and a freshly painted fence. But on your right, there's a house with a broken window, graffiti on the siding, and overgrown weeds everywhere. So which side makes you feel safer? Which one would you rather live next to? Well, the source argues the answer is totally obvious. We naturally gravitate toward order, right? And we feel threatened by visible decay. And it's this basic human instinct that acts as the launchpad for the entire political argument we're about to explore.
All right, here's our roadmap for today. 1. The core concept. 2. Origins of the theory. 3. The political accusation. 4. The policing debate. And finally, 5. The proposed solution.
Let's start with Section 1, the core concept, and defining the sociological framework.
The entire argument actually anchors on something called the broken windows theory. This was developed back in 1982 by social scientists James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling in a pretty famous article. Essentially, this theory suggests that visible signs of disorder, like, say, a single unrepaired broken window, send a very loud psychological signal to the surrounding community. And that signal is, nobody is in charge here and nobody cares.
Now, here's the crucial takeaway from the source's perspective. They don't just view these minor signs of neglect as symptoms of a struggling neighborhood. No, they view them as the actual root cause of the problem. It's like a chain reaction. If you leave one window broken, eventually people are going to throw rocks and break the rest. If a neighborhood looks abandoned, it practically invites drug dealing, vandalism, and eventually violent crime. Literally, disorder breeds disorder.
Moving on to Section 2, the origins of the theory, taking us from Palo Alto all the way to the Bronx. So the idea itself actually predates that 1982 paper. It traces back to a really bold 1969 experiment by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. From there, it got formalized in the 80s, and then most famously, it was transformed into hard policy on the streets of New York City in the 1990s. Understanding this evolution is absolutely vital because it shows how a simple academic test morphed into a massive real-world policing strategy.
In a really stark contrast, Zimbardo parked two identical cars, both without license plates, in two drastically different neighborhoods. The car left in the rough streets of the South Bronx. It was stripped and vandalized within hours. Meanwhile, the car in the quiet, upscale community of Palo Alto sat completely untouched for an entire week. But here's the fascinating twist. Once the researcher deliberately smashed a window on the Palo Alto car himself, the affluent residents enthusiastically jumped in and joined the destruction too. Vandalism, it turns out, is a learned opportunity. Chaos isn't just about demographics, it's about the environment signaling what kind of behavior is acceptable.
Which brings us to Section 3, the political accusation, and how this theory gets weaponized.
All right, here is the explosive core thesis of the commentary we're analyzing. It alleges that the urban decay we see in many inner-city, predominantly black communities is not an accident, it's not a failure of policy. Rather, they claim it's a deliberate, intentional strategy enacted by Democratic politicians since 1965. The accusation is literally that politicians have purposely left the metaphorical windows broken to foster helplessness, which in turn creates a dependent voting bloc that has to rely on government assistance. When you look at historical voting patterns, roughly 80 to 90% of bloc voters consistently vote for the Democratic Party. And the source poses a really blunt question here. Why give this massive voting power, which is essentially their most valuable asset, to a party that has overseen decades of failing schools, rising crime, and sustained neighborhood neglect? And this brilliantly illustrates the specific data the source leverages to back up that massive claim. They point to out-of-wedlock birth rates in the black community, noting a jump from 24% back in 1965 to 73% today. They fiercely argue that this demographic shift backwards was directly caused by Great Society programs and the war on poverty. Essentially, they claim it turned the community into a welfare state, using financial assistance as a sort of father replacement program. Building off those stats, the material outlines exactly what it claims was targeted by this alleged political strategy. The argument is that the political left intentionally dismantled the nuclear family, pulled Christianity and prayer out of public life, incentivized fathers leaving the home, and replaced genuine educational opportunities with schools that basically just function as daycare centers. By removing these cultural pillars, they argue, politicians made sure the community remained trapped in a cycle of dependency. This right here is the ultimate weaponization of the broken window.
Next up is Section 4, the policing debate, weighing law and order against the human cost.
Taking this theory from paper to the real world created a massive divide. Proponents of broken windows policing point straight to New York City in the 1990s under Mayor Rudy Giuliani. By strictly cracking down on minor offenses like subway fare evasion or graffiti, supporters say major crime plummeted and the city became safe again. But critics push back hard. They argue that focusing on these tiny infractions led to highly aggressive policing tactics. They point out that it resulted in widespread racial profiling, mass incarceration, and disproportionately devastated communities that were already vulnerable.
Now, the source we're looking at entirely rejects that critical pushback. They argue that words like marginalized and disenfranchised are really just code words used by the political left to excuse crime and reinstitute chaos. To them, avoiding strict policing just because you're afraid of being labeled racist is exactly what allows the hood to remain the hood. And ultimately, they say, that harms the very people the critics claim they're trying to protect.
The commentary also brings this ongoing debate right up to the present day, pointing to an April 2026 Supreme Court ruling, a 6-3 decision. The source expresses deep frustration with this, arguing that the ruling essentially prevents communities from legally cracking down on the exact minor offenses that spark larger urban decay. They view it as just another systemic roadblock keeping us from repairing the broken windows.
Finally, Section 5, the proposed solution and how to reverse the decay. So, how do they say we fix it? The source offers a pretty clear, 4-step, heavily conservative prescription for inner-city communities. Step 1, a return to strict law and order, backing the police and rejecting chaos. Step 2, rebuilding the cultural pillars of strong two-parent families and faith-based values. Step 3, demanding real education and actual job training instead of relying on government handouts. And lastly, Step 4, a total cultural shift to reject the narrative of victimhood entirely and instead embrace personal accountability and success.
To drive this whole solution home, the commentary invokes Donald Trump's provocative campaign question directed at black voters, "What the hell do you have to lose?" They use this as a rallying cry. They're urging voters to look at decades of stagnation and crime and to boldly break their historical cycle of political loyalty. The core of the argument is simply, hey, the current system hasn't repaired the windows yet, so maybe it's time to try a completely different approach.
Well, that brings us to the end of our analysis. We've seen how a sociological experiment involving a car in the Bronx can evolve over decades into a deeply polarizing, highly charged partisan battle cry. Regardless of where you fall in the political spectrum, breaking down how these arguments are constructed really helps us understand the media we're consuming every day. So, we'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. When sociological theories become political battlegrounds, caught somewhere between accusations of intentional neglect and fears of systemic overreach, who is actually stepping up to repair the windows? Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and keep asking the tough questions.